Hello, I'm Kelly Eversole. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm president of Eversole Associates, a science and technology consulting firm, and also executive director of the Phytobiomes Alliance and the International Wheat Genome Sequencing Consortium. In full transparency, I'm also an adjunct faculty member or affiliate at Colorado State University. And we're joined today by two of my colleagues at Colorado State, Jeni Cross and Ann Mook, both from the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences and scientific collaborations in both international and interdisciplinary settings. But before we get to start with the webinar, let me give you a little bit of background about our two consortia. The International Alliance for Phytobiomes Research is a nonprofit, pre-competitive research consortium. We were established in mostly by industry in 2016. And we have members and partners in 8 countries, and we're always looking for additional ones. And we're trying to coordinate a paradigm shift in agricultural research and production that will lead to multidisciplinary research activities. And I want to thank our sponsors for the Phytobiomes Alliance because they enable us to do these kinds of webinars. Our next, just to let you know, our next Phytobiomes webinar will be at the end of May, and we'll focus on hydroponic agriculture. I don't know if any of you have cats, but mine has decided to control the webinar today. So apologize for that in advance. So also just to mention the International Wheat Genome Sequencing Consortium, we are also a nonprofit pre-competitive consortium that was established by growers and academia in 2005. We have partners and leaders in 72 countries, and we're focused on developing tools for breeders to enhance breeding, wheat genome breeders, or wheat genome tools, and you can find out more information on that. For both of these consortia, moving to multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research is absolutely essential if we're going to be able to achieve all of our objectives. And I want to thank our IWGSC sponsors again for supporting us. And just to go quickly over the webinar dashboard, you can submit your questions on the on your questions panel. Don't put them in the chat because I won't necessarily see them, and I'm going to be the one who asks the questions. So please monitor the chat, however, so you do see messages from the organizers. You can already download PDFs of both my presentation, which will have links in it, as well as the presentations from my colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jeni Cross, who is the director of the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences and a professor of sociology at Colorado State. And she's also the director of the Team Science Core for the Colorado Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute. She and her team have developed a series of team science competency workshops that they offer to sites across the country. And she, of course, has been working and has been involved in large international team science projects. And Mook, pardon me if I've mispronounced that, is a senior team scientist at the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences. She's a Dutch citizen, and so we are very fortunate to have her at Colorado State University. In her role, she coaches large interdisciplinary and international teams on how to collaborate and assess their progress with interviews, focus groups, surveys, and social network analysis. So let me welcome and turn this over to Anne and Jeni, and I look forward to seeing the presentation. And put your questions in the panel in the dashboard at any point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that great introduction. We are very excited to be here and share a little bit more about team science. I'm not sure if people can see my screen yet. Do they?
Yes, we're good. I think so.
Okay, great. All right, wonderful. All right, so today I would like to share some information about scientific collaboration in interdisciplinary and international settings. And I will be presenting today together with the director of our institute, Jeni Cross. We already had a great introduction, so I don't think we should waste too much time on that. So what are we going to talk about today? So first, I want to share a little bit of information about the trends that we have in the science of team science. Then I want to share a couple of examples of how team science really makes an impact. And finally, I want to share some tricks and tools about how you can work well in interdisciplinary and international settings, given that we have so many boundaries in communication. So before we start, I am really curious to know where this audience is from. I initially intended to have a poll that is a little bit broader, but unfortunately we only have 5 options. So we will launch a poll right now, and please share with us in which continent you are currently. Okay, I see that 81% of you have responded so far. Isabel, would you be able to share where the attendees from today are from?
Yes, so we have 49% of attendees from North America, 7% from Latin and South America, 25% from Europe, 15% from Asia, and 5% from Africa.
Wow, that's wonderful. We really have a panel from all over the world. And I think that really indicates to me that many of you are probably working very internationally. So I hope that this webinar is going to be helpful and gives you some insights. So let me start with sharing some of the trends that we have in the science of team science. So as you know, we all live in a global world that have like big global imperatives, but at the same time, we also realize that we have very unique problems that are very much confined by time and space and place. So we have huge potential if we work together to understand and address some of these big problems that we have. So some of these problems, as you may imagine, are climate change, are feeding the globe, and I'm sure that many of you are thinking about these two issues, as well as how we can improve human health, how can we end homelessness, how can we explore the universe. And in the United States, we have the National Science Foundation, which funds a lot of the academic research. And we have similar organizations in other places, I'm sure in Europe and Latin America and so forth. So what we really start to see and what governments are increasingly funding is these kind of problems. And we understand that we have these big problems that we cannot solve with one discipline alone. We really need to work together to create convergence by merging ideas and approaches and technologies to stimulate innovation and discovery. So as a result, there are many current shifts in science, because how we were doing science in the past is not going to be sufficient to address the problems of the future. So our science has really become a lot more complex. So as you know, initially we were just starting out with more simple things like understanding that our world is round and understanding evolution theory and understanding DNA to increasingly much more complex problems. As you can see in this picture, I think very well that there is this big interaction between people and ideas and the existing literature of information that we have found and discovered so far. So how can we address these increasingly complicated, difficult problems? Well, there's a couple of things. So one of the things is open science. As you know, a lot of peer-reviewed information is behind paywalls, and it makes it really more difficult for people to access information. So we would want to make our science more accessible. And it's not only peer-reviewed journals, but also making our data available, maybe translating our work into multiple languages so that a broader audience is able to access the information that we have. The other thing is we really need to start working in bigger teams, because no one really has all the information and all the insights about everything that's happening in the world. Everyone has its own expertise, whether that is a particular method or particular way of data collection or a specific substantive field. And we really need to work together as a big team, bringing in our specific expertise and converging that to drive new innovative science and address the big problems that we have. The other thing is that we have so much more analytic power and big data that we can work with these days, and really, learning the methods to use that and working together in order to make sense of that data is going to be really important moving forward. And then finally, like, our science has become so much more complex. I think that's the title of this slide as well. The science is growing in complexity. So we really need to delve into this complexity and bring our different levels of expertise to address these complicated problems. So when we think, so as I said, the National Science Foundation in the United States is really thinking about converging more research, as well as some of the other funding organizations in other places in the world where you may be. So what they're really doing is really hoping that we can support these research teams with people of different skills and substantive knowledge, and really build these multidisciplinary teams that really transcend these boundaries and can build these novel conceptual frameworks, theories, and methods. So And how can we do this? Well, first of all, when we do our research, we really should think about a specific and compelling problem that arises from deep scientific questions and pressing societal needs. And we really need this deep integration across disciplines. So if we want to address the problems that we have today, we need to combine our knowledge, our theories, our methods, our data, our research communities, and our languages to really develop these new frameworks, paradigms, and maybe even entire new disciplines to be innovative and effective in addressing the complex problems that we have today. So, not unsurprisingly, you will see that whereas in the past, a lot of people were doing research alone or in very small teams, now we see that teams are growing very substantially in size. So in this slide, what you will see is, on the one hand, you see the mean team size, and then you can see it how the size of the team grew by different disciplines. So in science and engineering in particular, you will see that teams grew in size very significantly from the 1900s to the 2000s. And you will see the red dotted line is the overall size of all teams, and the black ones are the ones that receive more citations than average, so they're very impactful teams. So team size is growing very fast. In the social sciences too, especially the very impactful teams tend to be much larger, but overall we see an increasing trend. Unfortunately, in the arts and the humanities, we see maybe a slight uptick, but it is much lower. And we see too that people who work in teams in science and engineering are really much more impactful. And one of the ways how we can measure impact is citations. Obviously, we have many more ways of thinking about impact, but those who work in teams are 6.3 times more likely to receive 1,000 citations. So working in teams is definitely really important to be successful and impactful. At the same time, what we also see is when we think about interdisciplinarity. And what we mean by interdisciplinarity is that you work between different disciplines. So a lot of us have maybe been trained in a particular discipline. I have been trained in sociology. Maybe some of you have been trained in things like ecology or biology or agricultural communication and other fields. So in terms of interdisciplinarity, we don't see really this massive increase yet that we saw in the growth of teams. So this is a study from 2015, so hopefully things are improving a little bit, but we see only a slight increase in interdisciplinarity if we measure the references used in scientific articles. So here we see that the percentage of references within the same specialty remains somewhat stable, is going down a little bit towards the end, both for the social science and the natural sciences and engineering. Then the other is references to other specialties with in the same discipline. So this could be, for example, I am trained as an environmental sociologist. I may borrow some information from, for example, economic sociology or medical sociology. And here in blue, we see, maybe even a little bit of decrease, and then references to other disciplines, which is really what is measuring interdisciplinarity. We see a little bit of an uptake in the past few years, both in natural sciences and engineering and social sciences. But I think so far the increase is relatively small. So I hope this will increase even further in the future. Another way of looking at interdisciplinarity is looking at who is citing others from another field and who gets cited by others by other fields. So we see whether a field is interdisciplinary really depends a lot of the field of study. So in this case, what we can see is, for example, international relations is really a field that rarely cites people outside of their own discipline, and also rarely gets cited by others. But if you go up, for example, chemical physics is much more likely to cite others, but a little bit less likely still to be cited by people from other disciplines. But if you look at general biology, geriatrics, and gerontology or social studies of medicine, we really see that these are quite interdisciplinary fields that do cite other fields and also get cited by other fields. Also, international collaborations in the 2020s are increasing, fortunately, quite rapidly, which is great, especially with such an international audience as we have today. And what we see here is the percentage of international collaborations on articles in engineering. So we see in orange articles that have only domestic authors, and then in purple we see international collaborations. So we see China, the United States, United Kingdom, they all have like percentages that somewhere range between 20 to 50%, especially Germany, France, Spain, Australia are countries that do extremely well on interdisciplinary collaborations. So you may wonder, well, that's great. A lot more people are working together in teams. I can see like the world is more complex. We need to work more in teams collaboratively. What are the impacts of working in teams, and why should I really work on my relationships with other team members to keep this being successful and even perhaps grow the teams that I'm currently working in? So here is an example of a team that we work very closely with at the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, which is led by Catherine O'Reilly, who is a lake specialist. And in this slide, we see water samples that have been taken from all over the world on a paper with 63 authors to better understand rising temperatures in lake surface waters. So we can see like if we have like this big data that comes from many countries and many authors, that we're able to make much bigger conclusions about lakes than we were able in the past when we maybe had only a couple of samples. So I think here is another example of a paper that has been published by Chiarovelli and Serrano about how we can now do this new ecological science. So in this paper, in this figure that you see here, you can see the first step of doing this better new ecological science is extrapolating data. And so in the first one, you see current time to current time, and you can see that when we extract data from the same type of ecological system, it is represented in the same color. So you see we can now get data from multiple similar and diverse types of ecological sites. And if we use all of these different samples together, we can scale it up and we can get much better information about what may be happening in particular types of ecosystems. And if we continue doing this over time with the historical data that we have, the current data and the future data, we are much better able to predict what is happening in our world, especially in the field of ecology. But it is not just ecology, of course. Using networks of multiple layers, we can start to understand much more. So in one study by Helmut and Kramer in 2020, they analyzed infectious diseases. So they wanted to understand first, what kind of behavior makes it more likely that someone gets an infectious disease? So did they adopt these intervention strategies, yes or no? So that is in the first place. So we see some of them did not adopt it and 2 of them did adopt it. Then we want to find out like whether these individuals are, are going to get the disease. So you see the same people are kind of connected with each other through these dotted lines from the one level, from the behavior level to the disease level. And here we can see like who is maybe susceptible of getting the disease, who actually is infectious now, and who has been recovered. And then finally, we can also see like to what extent did a mass media campaign help? Were these people informed or uninformed? So you see, if we look at multiple levels, we can get much better information, and we need multiple disciplines to do this, right? We would need social scientists, biologists, people from the medical field, etc. And the same thing is true in many areas of biology and other disciplines as well. Another example that you might find interesting is that how everything is interrelated in biology. For example, we can think about genes and co-expression networks, molecular networks, cellular networks, tissue networks, hospital networks. They all interact on these different levels with one another. So thinking about networks and how they work is super important. Another example would be discoveries for treatment of mental health condition. For example, there is a paper that written by Kimball et al. That if you have a particular gene that's called DRD2, you're more likely to get certain things, especially if it's coupled with a G protein receptor. So if you have this combination, you're more likely to have ADHD, problems with sleep, schizophrenia, these kind of things, which then in turn will lead to suicide attempts. So you can see here too, you really need a big team of people together from genomics, from medicine, from psychiatry, from the social science to find out these interdisciplinary correlations. So, but interdisciplinarity is not always encouraged by many universities because of rewards. People like to see articles that are published in journals that they're familiar with within their own fields, but also because of people's success is often measured by things like citations. And one of the things that we see, the short-term impact of interdisciplinary work, we see that people tend to get less citations. So on average, if we looked at the 3-year mark, interdisciplinary work got less citations than work that is more disciplinary. But on the other hand, if we look 13 years later, which is not great for our immediate reward system, we do see that if your work is interdisciplinary, the level of citations is going to increase. Another thing that we find is that if your team is flatter, you're going to have a lot more impact. So you don't want to have a team that is particularly hierarchical. And you may wonder, like, how do you even measure whether a team is hierarchical or not? So a group of scientists looked at all the papers published in PNAS, Nature, Science, and PLOS One, and they looked at the roles and responsibilities of these published papers. So they identified people who lead or write or supervise, conceive, interpret, design, coordinate as leaders, and then other tasks such as developing, analyzing, collecting, preparing, those kind of things, assisting, would be seen as direct support. And then others such as discussing and editing would be seen as indirect support. So they measured an L ratio, which is where if most authors are all in these leading roles, we would see that as a team that is less hierarchical, so more flat. Whereas if we see that maybe one person is leading and everyone else would be in a support role, then we would have a paper with a lower L ratio. So with that, they were able to predict like to what extent the relative contribution was of leaders and supporters. And they would also predict the probability of how this will look in the future. So one of the things I think is quite interesting to see is that we see that, for example, if the team size grows, we often see less hierarchical teams. So if we look at how flatter teams, what kind of impact they have, we see that they have much greater impact. So if you have a higher L ratio, so you have more leaders on your team, which you can see in figure A, your work is much more likely to be novel. At the same time, what we also see, if you're working on team as a lead author, you're probably less productive as a lead. And finally, the long-term citation impact, if you are in a flatter team, is going to be much, much higher. So I think this is really the way to go and a place where we would like to see our research go. So this is all great. So I just shared with you like what trends we have in science, and we are working towards a scientific place that is much more interdisciplinary, is much more international. We know that this is going to help us get much better work and research, but how do we do these kind of things really well? Because any of you that have worked in an interdisciplinary team or international team may know that it is very easy that you get some misunderstandings and some miscommunications. And I would like to give you like a little bit of insight of how we may have these barriers and also what can we do to overcome these kind of barriers. So the first, and I guess the most obvious, is really this idea of language, right? Like if you speak a different language, my own native language, for example, is Dutch, you will know that there may be words that are very similar that you may misunderstand, or accents, or the way how you express yourself. I tend to be much more expressive than most Americans, and I tend to be much more direct in what I say, and that is not always understood if you are not communicating those differences well and you understand who you're talking with. But obviously, language is one very important one, but it's not the only one. Another thing that we really have to think about is power and status. So who is making the order and the rules, and who comes to power, who maintains the power, and who loses the power. So how we think about power is really culture dependent. I, for example, come from the Netherlands, which has like a pretty egalitarian political system. And perhaps in the United States, it may be a little bit more hierarchical, and maybe even more hierarchical in other places. And it's not just about country, right? We can also see that perhaps between disciplines, the differences in power and status might be very different in, for example, business school as opposed to maybe ecology or a sociology department. Another thing that we really want to think about is like our physical preferences and what level of intimacy we're comfortable with. In some cultures they may be very close. It's very normal to hug and kiss each other when you greet each other and to sit very close to each other. In other cultures, not so much. Or how you use time. In some cultures, Dutch, for example, love to be very, very punctual, and it's pretty rude to be a little bit late. I think in the United States, being 2 or 3 minutes late is not the end of the world. And in other places, perhaps with time, they're even a little bit more flexible. Also, the expectations that you may have of work relationships. Are you strictly talking about work, or maybe intermingling a little bit of social time, as well as like maybe you even want to be friends and things like that. And also how relationships work between sexes. What is okay to say, what is not okay to say. Is it fine to touch someone on the shoulder, or is it not okay? These can be very big differences. The other thing might be rewards and punishments of what is good or bad behavior. Some examples might be, for example, like, well, how loud you speak, or whether you should be very competitive or not so competitive. These are things that may vary a lot between different countries and different disciplines as well. ideology like religion and things like that? How do you give meaning to unexplainable events? Or are you gonna look at through the eyes of a specific discipline or a specific author or framework or another way? And then also things like emotions. How do you express yourself? How do you deal with stress? What level of uncertainty is okay and acceptable for you? And then as well, like what kind of cultural differences may there be? Like what kind of attitudes, values, and beliefs do you have? So thinking about all these things as barriers and knowing that they exist, I think is really important to also find ways to address them. So let me give you a couple of examples of how maybe the Americans and the Dutch may have some international miscommunication. For example, as I said earlier, the Dutch are very direct, and they kind of tend to really take things the way they are. So in the United States, for example, people may be very generous and say, do you want more tea? Do you want a cookie? Something like that. And an American may say, I'm good. And that's not very literal, right? So if you lived some time in the United States, you may know like, oh, that just means no, thank you. But in the Netherlands, it would be much more like, oh, maybe good will mean yes, or maybe they misunderstood the question. So they can be easily confused. Similarly, like things like break a leg. If you lived in the United States or another English-speaking country, you may know that this just means good luck. In the Netherlands, we often, like to refer to some diseases and things like that when we get angry with each other. So it may be considered, maybe something that is not so positive. Similarly, like just things like, how are you? Like in America, you may just walk past someone and it is almost like, hi, there's almost this expectation that you say like, good. Not everyone is necessarily interested in knowing your whole life story and the details of how your day has been. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, it's much more likely that when you say things like, how are you, that people want to know in much more detail how you are. Same thing with compliments. Americans constantly will say, oh, I love your earrings, I love your dress, I love your hair, and things like that. And, Dutch people from time to time, they may give some compliments, but not to that level. And it is very easy to think like, what does this person want from me? And another example might be like, I feel like most Europeans or Dutch are much more likely to, share their emotions or give some criticism. And Americans, they try to avoid that, I think, to a much greater extent, and that is considered professional. A great example would be a letter of recommendation, right? The letter of recommendation in the United States is always glowing and it says all these great things about someone. And if a Dutch person would receive it, I think it's much more likely that they would be wondering like, well, does this person actually know this person well? Why are there no negative things about this person? It's much more common to give a comprehensive overview of someone and what are the good aspects of this person and what are the bad aspects of this person. So similarly, we may have these kind of problems within different disciplines. I work with a lot of large interdisciplinary teams, mostly the biology integration institutes. And sometimes when I see what they're writing about, I think, oh, I totally know what they're talking about. And sometimes it turns out they're talking about something completely different. So one time they were talking about a population and I did not immediately understand. They were talking about a group of organisms and I would think immediately a group of people. And biologists, they also all seem to have like a favorite protein. So when someone came to me and asked me what my favorite protein was, I would imagine that, they were looking for an answer like chicken. And of course, everyone was laughing. Similarly, concentration, like what is the amount of a substance in a certain tissue or liquid, and we think about that much more of like, oh, I have high levels of, I have concentration, I'm really focused. Or carbonate, we're talking about like, chemical compounds as opposed to a drink with bubbles, or a colony, which is more like a couple of individuals living in close association, and as a social scientist, you would much more think about the territory subject to a form of rule. So easy to understand that there may be like some big differences. And when we don't acknowledge these differences, or we don't want to think about it, it can become a problem. It can become a situation where we just don't understand what we mean from each other. And we often just assume that someone is very similar to us, even though they may not be similar, or they may just express their similar thoughts in a very different way. So sometimes we need to have a little bit of room for interpretation. However, as you know, being different is not a problem. It actually may be an advantage, right? We just saw like having different disciplines, having international collaboration, it gives us all these new perspectives of things, which gives us great solutions to these big challenges that we have in science. But what we have to do is we have to make sure that this diversity is well managed. So you can think about creating some team processes, like a team identity, really having this value of valuing differences, and acknowledging that some constructive conflict may be good, and having a team identity, and have good communication skills and that kind of things. And this will really lead to tons of creativity and high performing people and quality outcomes, and people will be really satisfied in their job, and they will have peer mentoring. But if we don't manage this well, if we don't think about our differences, if we don't learn to value our differences, we will get conflict, poor communication, interpersonal strain, and this will just lead to high turnover, low quality work, low job satisfaction, all these things we absolutely want to avoid. So what can we do to make sure it is all going to be good when we work together? So I can share some guidelines for good communication. So one thing that's really great when you start working in a team, and maybe you can start thinking about some templates. At Iris, we have a lot of templates that we share with the teams that we coach, is like having a way of avoiding slangs and acronyms and jargon, so that we still understand each other. We have also some norms about what should and what shouldn't be discussed. There may be big differences between disciplines or between countries. Also, we're very explicit or clear about the level of formality that we want. For us at the Institute of Research in the Social Sciences, for example, we don't really use titles. We really try to be very equal, and we call each other by the first name. But I mean, either way is fine, but having clarity about what is expected, I think, is really good. The other thing is, like, how do you even communicate with each other? We may have very different personal boundaries about we like to text each other on the phone. Does need to be over email? Are we gonna use a platform like Slack or Teams or Basecamp? Just having clarity about where to communicate, but also when, like how often should we communicate? Sometimes there may be a lot of misunderstandings about too many meetings, not enough meetings, who should participate, do we need to have everyone in these meetings, or can we just work with a particular subgroup? Is it okay to call someone outside work hours on their cell phone, things like that? How do we deal with silence? Some people in some countries and some disciplines may be very good with having some silence, and it gives them some space to think. Other people may be, much more uncomfortable with these things. As well as if you work internationally or even at different institutions, that means that a lot of your work will be virtual. So what are you going to do about, will you have your cameras on? Will you have your microphones on when you're online or not? But even with great guidelines of communication, it's not going to solve all the possible problems that you may face. So, sometimes you may say something and it may not be received the way that you intended. So one way to go about that is, really look at someone's nonverbal clues. you can often learn a lot about whether they will smile or what kind of facial expression, or whether they are gonna fold their arms or something like that, about how your message is received. Also, you may be receiving some information and you may want to check if what you understood is actually what that person meant, because often a lot of context is going missing, either in different disciplines or in different cultures. So one way is to really ask, like, hey, what did you mean by that? Just to make sure that you have the same context and the same interpretation. Another thing, and this is something that I did with almost all my teams and repeatedly all the time, is that each part of the project, we talk with each other and we repeat our interpretation. So I explain maybe part of my research or a method, and maybe this other person in the team should not be in a level where they can write all the R code or something and do exactly what I did. But they should be able to understand, like, what steps we took and what the purpose is and what the outcomes and interpretation should be. So repeating what someone else is saying and just checking in with them to make sure that you're at the same page is really great. But even then, if you do all these things, you still may sometimes have some of these barriers. So sometimes one thing that could be really helpful is maybe having some information on the cultural differences. If you know you're working with someone from another country, maybe look up what are the specific cultural expectations in China, or what are the specific interpretations in Brazil, or what are the specific interpretations in Canada of things. Just having like a little bit of a sense of, you know, the culture of people you work with. And the same thing is true for disciplines as well. You can also maybe look at the guidelines of specific organizations that you work with. And finally, a lot of institutions, especially bigger businesses or universities and things like that, may offer free counseling or things like that. So I think it's always great if someone is struggling to maybe recommend, like, hey, I noticed like that you are struggling with some miscommunication. You know, we have some great resources for people you can talk with to better understand how to navigate your experiences in this country or this discipline, or like the interpersonal things that you may face. And then finally, I think one thing that is super important is to be aware of oneself and others. No matter what country someone is from, or no matter what discipline someone has studied, everyone is different. And we don't have a guide or a strategy that can really overcome all these different nuances. So with some people, a certain style of communication may work well, and with others, not so much. It may depend, for example, by how extrovert someone is, or things like that. So I think one thing that would be really important is to really be genuine and share who you are and why, what formed you that way as a person. So really trying to sometimes be vulnerable. Brene Brown, who is a well-known psychologist in the United States, has actually written a book about that. Like, if you're more vulnerable and you share what your personal history is and why you became the person that you are, people will understand you a lot better, will be better able to work with you. And at the same time, I really encourage people to be curious and get to know who the people are they work with on a team and really know their styles. So, of course, like, you can get to know each other sometimes a lot in Zoom calls and emails and all kinds of communication, but oftentimes spending time together as a group and with individuals, having that social time for which you can be creative virtually as well, to really get to know each other, I think is really important to bond as a team and as group members, and you know, be productive scientists as well. So that was my presentation for today. I think we left about 10 minutes for questions and answers.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. It's really fascinating. Jeni, before we go into the questions, would you like to add anything or?
Yeah, I think I would just say that the one kind of big insight from the social sciences is that one of the most underlooked things when we think about any kind of change effort we're trying to make, and we're talking about big changes in science, and when we're talking about collaboration, one of the most underestimated tools that we have is setting clear behavioral expectations. And Anne spoke a lot about this, about having group norms and talking about these things. But another part of setting expectations is just talking about yourself, telling people, what can you expect from me? So I tell all of my collaborators and all of my students, I tell them what my strengths are. I'm a really great big picture thinker, but I also tell them what I'm terrible at. And one of the things I like to joke and make fun of myself and be vulnerable, as Anne was saying, is I tell people, you know, when God created me, they just left out the tact gene. I didn't come with the tact gene installed, and I say all kinds of things, and only after it comes out of my mouth do I think, oh, that probably sounded terrible. So if I tell people that I'm missing it, then my collaborators, you know, it's easier for them to say, hey, Jeni, what you just said kind of offended me, and we can all laugh about how I got misinterpreted. So setting expectations on our teams about who we are, what strengths we bring to the team, and what our flaws are is probably the best tool that we all have for improving our collaboration across our differences.
So that brings up a really critical question, and that is for an individual to have self-awareness of what those strengths and weaknesses are. And, you know, for example, in our team in Eversole Associates, we all take StrengthsFinder just so, not to find the weaknesses, but really to find out what areas we should be focusing on. How do, you know, you have a PhD student who's got to, you know, put together their thesis. How do you train both students, students, postgraduates, or even team members in a company? How do you train them to be more self-aware?
I think that so self-awareness is one of the key competencies for team science. In the literature on what does it take to be a good team scientist, self-awareness is on the top of that list. And we create self-awareness for everyone all the time through our interactions. And we're either making space for us all to talk about and build our self-awareness as individuals or teams, or we're not. So formal activities like StrengthsFinders is a place we did for our team. We did that this last spring. We had people put their StrengthsFinders up, and then we also had people compliment other members of the team for the things they really appreciate about them. And then after everybody kind of did this gratitude exercise for the team, then we had everybody pair up, and we had one member of the team articulate what are the things that the team said I really value about you, alongside how does that match up with your strengths. And we didn't know how that was going to work out, but we created that as an activity for our team to improve all of our self-awareness of ourselves and our whole team. And we were just so delighted, like the things that are on our StrengthsFinders were really the things that we complimented each other for. And so how we do that in our regular meetings, making space to compliment each other, making space to talk about what we're struggling with. We really make structures in our team meetings for kind of what are the highlights going on for this week and where do we need help. And creating that space to ask for help helps other people know, you know, both like what's happening on the task level, but also what's happening on the personal level, that people struggle with different types of things when they're doing the work.
Yeah. So one of the questions that has come in is, you know, you've got these large teams, so what's the best way to encourage a team member, an in particular team member, to take on a leadership role? And then I would add to that, how do you then deal with things like authorship? You know, big question, very important for scientific careers. So maybe Anne or Jeni, and either one of you have a thought about how we get people to take leaders, to become leaders?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that we always start with whenever we start with a project is to have an authorship agreement. Because I think it's really important that we know from the beginning, like what we're going to do, what we're aiming for as a journal that we want to send our work to, like who is willing to take on what roles, etc. But at the same time, I think it's really important that, it is not something that is being set in stone, because when we start a project, that's not always the same way it works out. But it's nice to have something on paper that you can refer to, and kind of whenever things change, have a discussion like, oh, we just got this reviewer feedback and now we need to do all this additional analyses. And, the person who was originally taking the lead doesn't have the time or doesn't have the expertise or things like that. And now this other person has to step up. That you kind of have this discussion like, okay, this is what we started with, but now things have changed. So now that this person is going to step up and do all the work, you just have a conversation about it like, okay, well, that means that, maybe now that I'm going to do all the work and redo all the analyses or do this analysis that I didn't do before, like that means that I need to be higher in the authorship rank than I was before. So having clear expectations from the very beginning, I think, is really important. I think the other thing that I always aim for is to be generous in who, we acknowledge and who has helped with our research, because even if it's something small, at the very least, you can include someone in acknowledgements and, be grateful for all the help that you get, because no one really does their research. Well, very few does it alone, and if not, we are formed by all the great mentors that we have. And the other thing is, I would be in particular, very generous to the next generation of scholars that really need these publications and really need to build this resume in order to get the job or get the promotion or things like that, as opposed to, people who may be a little bit higher up in the ladder. I don't know if Jeni has something to add to that as well. I'm sure she does.
I would just echo and reiterate what Anne said about having these really explicit conversations. We do have a sample authorship agreement template that we can share and distribute that people can work off of. And so we'll be sure to have that sent out. And then circling back to Kelly's question about how do we move people up into positions of leadership, that citation from the article about that flatter teams are more successful really tells us that we need to be creating lots of opportunities for leadership in our teams. And when we have clarity about our strengths, we can help people get situated in their role, right? Why would you like to take on this leadership? How does it help you manifest your strengths? And also, how does it help you to grow? And so those best conversations are really about what support do you need in order to take a leadership position on. And, we might find that the person who's currently been doing that role isn't the best support person. It might be someone else, but just asking the question, what support would you need to take on new leadership, usually can help us find the sweet spot, not just for individuals growing, but also for the team to grow.
Great. So, one of the challenges that I think any scientist has, regardless of their status in their career, in their community, is getting funding for, quote, non-scientific aspects of their projects. Have you seen trends that would be positive in this direction? More opportunities for people who are project managers, who actually can kind of step in and guide on some of these kinds of issues? What's your experience over the past maybe 10 years? Are funding agencies more aware of the need for this?
I think some are. I think it's variable. Another one of our senior team scientists just submitted an article for publication yesterday about the really important role that program coordinators and team scientists and other kinds of boundary spanning positions that are not doing the science but are really working to coordinate the team. On our own campus, our vice president for research supports teams, and in that project he requires that office requires a certain amount of the budget to go towards those project coordinating activities. And what I would say is that every team I work with is discovering new ways that what they need are boundary spanning positions instead of the simplest way that faculty build budgets is how much time for a faculty member and how many grad students or postdocs. And what they're missing are postdocs that cross between labs, or a program coordinator that is really supporting the whole thing. I think that funding agencies are really supportive of it. I think it's at smaller, more local levels that funders really understand the essentialness of it and are maybe requiring, at least that's what we've seen like at university levels, that people say, you've got to have this. I think that funders are willing to do it. I myself just had a grant from NSF, and I put in a person who was a soft-funded position for more than 2 months. And for faculty, it was a research scientist type person, faculty, they cap it at 2 months. I just had to write a justification for why this person, wasn't on a faculty line, but deserves to have 4 months of work. And so I found that they were really open, even though it kind of is a little outside the boundaries of what they're familiar with.
Yeah. So kind of, in other words, don't be as conservative when you're writing your proposals as we tend to be, because we're so scared we're going to get rejected.
Exactly. I think write about it and write clearly about the need and what the function is of that person. The more complex our teams are, the more we need that kind of boundary spanning and coordination and integration teams. And if we say this position is here to do this, you could even cite the 1 or 2 of the articles, here about that our differences aren't what matters, but how we manage them is. And so good management, even in the US, the National Science Foundation on these large grants has actually created a new section, which is your collaboration, integration, and management plan. So they're asking for that really specifically. And so there's no reason for us not to be planning new things and being innovative.
Yeah. Do you find at all that there is opposition, by different people to say, oh God, I've got to go to a workshop about how to get along with people or whatever? Do you find any of that? Or do you find people are really eager to learn how to do their science better and in a more transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary way?
Anne, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think people are very eager. This is, I think, why our roles exist, why we have so much demand from a lot of teams to have us as the team scientists on their big projects. And I think some of the data that we show today too is that we really see this increase in complexity, in team size, in international collaboration. And, with that, we will have our struggles too. And I think many of the audiences and other people may have experienced some of that. So they want to start thinking about how do we better work together. And some of the research really shows half of it of of science is doing the task work, having the right expertise, having the right skills. But the other half is really about having the right coordinations and interpersonal relationships and understanding of one another to be successful.
Have you thought about writing a guidebook for people who are not in the team science field or the science of team science? I mean, the template, for example, on authorship, that's a great thing that we'd like to get out. Almost all of the projects in which we are involved, regardless of the project, is very international, very multidisciplinary. So any of those things would be really helpful.
Yeah, we're working on that. We've been talking about where's a really great place to house those things so that they can just be really easily accessible. So thinking about whether or not putting it up on our university's digital commons is a place then that they could be cited and referenced and people could just pull them all up. So we're working on thinking about what that toolkit might be for a variety of these resources that people could access and celebrate.
Yeah. Well, I could ask a lot more questions about this, but we've already run over our time. So I'll give you a chance to any last comments you'd like to make, either one of you, Jeni or Ann.
No, I'm
Okay.
good.
All right.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you very
us.
much for your help, because I see it as really helping us think in a different way as we put projects together, and how we, in a time where, you know, we finally admitted that the world is complex and we have to embrace that complexity, we need to figure out better ways of approaching it. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we would welcome anything you'd like to put on, any links or any guides or best practices, et cetera, that we could put on our various websites to try to help advance this field. So thank you very much. And I hope to see many of the rest of you at our next webinar, which will be back to a little bit of the hardcore science. So although this is, let me see, I've just shown my problem. This is exactly the problem. I am going to assume that in genomics or genetics or whatever, that's real science and sociology is not. But it's not. That's not what you've shown has just proven the problem. So that's a good example of me being corrected after the webinar. So
Kelly, I would say my favorite comment from a team science person, I think this was like a postdoc who said it after one of our team science presentations. They said, my big aha today is that sociology and the social sciences can help us do our other science better. And so that's absolutely right. Science can help science be better.
That's exactly right. So I appreciate that very much, and I hope that I will get rid of my biases in this process. Well, thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.